Hello, and welcome to Hawk Mountain Sanctuary's Stay at Home speaker series. Today's program is Galaxy of Falcons with Scott Weidensaul, author, editor, field researcher, and chair of Hawk Mountain's Board of Directors.
Hey, how you doing, Jamie?
Thanks for joining us today, Scott.
My pleasure.
My name is Jamie Dawson. I'm the Director of Education at Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, and we are so glad that you are joining us today. Hawk Mountain is the world's very first refuge for birds of prey, and we continue to work hard to be leaders in raptor conservation, science, and education, locally and globally around the world. Hawk Mountain is a private nonprofit, and membership is the lifeblood of our organization. To all of our members, thank you so very much for your support. If you're joining us today and you're not a member, we hope that you consider becoming one in the future. Hawk Mountain hopes that everyone remains safe and healthy during these times of COVID challenges, and we are thrilled to offer our community a variety of virtual programming. As always, Hawk Mountain greatly appreciates and depends on donations. At any point during today's program, viewers may submit questions through the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform, and we've designated time at the end of the program to take some questions from the audience. And we are so excited that Scott Weidensaul is joining us today to share with us his adventures from Nagaland, India with the Amur Falcons. Before we get started, I'd love to share some of Scott's impressive background experience with our audience. Scott Weidensaul is the author of more than 24 books on natural history, including the Pulitzer Prize finalist, Living on the Wind, Return to Wild America, and The First Frontier. His newest book, A World on the Wing, about global migration, will be released next April. Scott is a contributing editor for Audubon, a columnist for Birdwatchers Digest, and writes for a variety of other publications, including Living Bird. He is also an active field researcher, studying saw-whet owl migration for more than 2 decades, as well as winter hummingbirds, bird migration in Alaska, and the winter movements of snowy owls through Project Snowstorm, which he co-founded. He is the chair of the Hawk Mountain Board and now lives in New Hampshire. So Scott, number one, you're a pretty busy guy. And number two, you are very passionate about birds and nature. How did you become so interested in natural history writing?
Well, the natural history writing is kind of an outgrowth of the fact that I've been passionate about natural history and nature since I was a kid. And I literally cannot remember a time when I wasn't interested in anything outdoors. You know, the irony is I wanted to be a wildlife artist. Well, first I wanted to be a biologist, and then discovered the whole math and science thing didn't work out that well for me. And then I was going to be a wildlife artist. This was when I was in college down at Kutztown University. And the problem was I wasn't very good at art. I loved it, but I wasn't very good at it. And I just kind of fell into writing back in the late 1970s, and have been doing it ever since. And until somebody makes me stop and forces me to get a real job, I'm going to keep doing it.
Never stop, never stop. So how did you become so involved in Hawk Mountain Sanctuary?
Well, I mean, it is, and I've told this story many times, but it's absolutely the truth. There's not a lot of people who can point to a single day in their life and say, this day changed my life. But my first visit to Hawk Mountain did that for me. I grew up in northern Schuylkill County, and when I was 12, and in October of the year that I was 12, my parents took me to Hawk Mountain. And I had been campaigning hard to go to Hawk Mountain for quite a while. I'd known about it for a long time. And several things happened to me that day. I got hooked on raptors because, I mean, raptors are cool. I mean, and it was the best migration day of the season that year, just by dumb luck. The air was full of birds. You know, I'm sitting up on the rocks and kind of yelling out identifications that were completely wrong because I was 12 and I didn't know what I was talking about. And there was an older woman that was sitting on the rocks in front of me, and she kept kind of turning around and looking at me and giving me the gimlet eye. And she finally said, son, sit down. You don't know what you're talking about. And then she sat down next to me and said, okay, now watch this bird coming. See how its head's kind of shrunk in, and it's got a long tail that's squared off, and it kind of flaps and glides and flaps and glides. That's a sharp-shinned hawk. Her name was Jean Litzenberger, and she became one of my mentors. So I got hooked on raptors that day. I got hooked on the Appalachian Mountains, which have been an important part of my writing and my career and my life ever since. And I got hooked on migration because the recognition that these birds that were coming from all over the north and passing almost directly over my house, heading to places like, you know, Mexico and Colombia and Argentina, that's powerful stuff for a kid. And you know, here I am, you know, 40 some years later, almost 40 years later, and it still hasn't let go of me. Actually, almost 50 years later, it hasn't let go of me. So yeah. Anyway, that's how. So I've been hooked with Hawk Mountain ever since.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And who would think that when you were that little boy that someday you would be the chair of the board of directors of Hawk Mountain. So good for you.
If they'd known, they'd have locked the door sooner.
So Scott, what inspired you to write your newest book, A World on the Wing?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Living on the Wind earlier, which is a book I did about 20 years ago about bird migration in the Western Hemisphere, and I've wanted for a long time to do a sequel to it. Because we've learned a lot more about bird migration in the last 20 years. We've learned more about the science of bird migration, how birds are able to do what they do, the physiological feats that birds are able to undertake in their migration. And as I think probably most of the people watching this today know, it is an increasingly difficult world for migratory birds. You know, between habitat loss and environmental toxins and growing human population and climate change and a whole lot of other things, it's a harder and harder thing for birds to get from point A to point B. And so this was an opportunity over about the last 4 years or so to revisit the subject of bird migration on a global scale. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute and cover some of the places that I went on this trip, and just kind of, you know, to take the pulse of bird migration today. Where are the conservation challenges? Where are the conservation opportunities for migratory birds? And also, you know, an excuse to visit some pretty cool places and see some really amazing migration. So.
Wonderful. Well, I think everyone's excited for your presentation, Galaxy of Falcons. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you very much, Jamie. And give me just a moment here. We'll work the magic of Zoom with screen share, and hopefully this will. All right. And with luck, everybody can see that. I do want to say I've got some video in a couple of places, and if you're having trouble seeing the video, you might want to make sure you turn off all of your other applications and things that might help. So as I said, I've been messing around with birds for a long time. I got my start actually in doing kind of hands-on bird research at Hawk Mountain back in the 1980s, working with Hawk Mountain's research crew, her band crew. And that was part of what fed into writing Living on the Wind in the 1990s. But as I said a moment ago, you know, it's been 20 years since that book came out. We've learned a lot more about migration in the years since then. So this new book that I've got that's coming out the tail end of March, beginning of April next year, called A World on the Wing, takes a global approach. And so, you know, I was chasing pelagic seabirds from the North Atlantic to the Gulf Stream and to the Bering Sea. I was over on the Yellow Sea in China, between China and the Koreas, which is, you know, one of the most significant migratory choke points in the world. About 11 million shorebirds a year pass through the Yellow Sea, this huge Australasian migration route that encompasses like New Zealand and Australia and much of Southeast Asia and Oceania and all the way up into Alaska and Russia. And one of the most imperiled migratory stopover points anywhere in the world. About 70% of the mudflats in the Yellow Sea have been destroyed, and yet you know, there's a lot of good news there. There's an international cadre of conservationists from China, from Europe, from Australasia that are working very hard to protect species like the critically endangered spoon-billed sandpiper and other migrants that are passing through the Yellow Sea. In the course of working on the book, I spent time in the Bahamas, not sitting on a beach, but back in poisonwood thickets with Dr. Nathan Cooper from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, who's using terrific new tracking technology to study the migrations of Kirtland's warblers. And in doing so, learn more about how what happens to migratory birds on the wintering ground affects them throughout the year, how these birds can actually develop kind of an ecological hangover if they have a bad winter in the tropics. I spent time in the Mediterranean, which is even to this day still a black hole for migratory birds. About somewhere between 11 million and 36 million migratory songbirds are killed and eaten every year in the Mediterranean. And so I spent time in Cyprus, where about 2.5 million songbirds are killed every year for this traditional food they call amburopoulia, which is devastating for bird populations there. But the Cypriot police, British authorities on some of the large military bases there are cracking down in new and creative ways using, for example, Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, law enforcement officers in sniper suits using surveillance cameras that have put a real dent in this illegal bird trafficking there. But, like I said, migration is getting harder and harder for migratory birds. And a lot of the stories are fairly grim. And so when you come across a story that encompasses all of these different threats and all of these different pressures that are facing migratory birds, and yet has a happy ending, that's an important thing. And so what I'd like to do is share one of those stories with you today. And that story is going to take us to one of the most remote areas in Asia, certainly the most remote area in India, in remote northeastern India in the state of Nagaland. And the species we're going to be talking about is the Amur falcon. Amur falcons are largely insectivorous falcons. They're about the size of an American kestrel, a little bit smaller than an American kestrel. And they have an enormous migration. It's arguably the longest migration of any raptor on Earth. They breed in northern China, North Korea, and up into parts of Russia. And every year they set out on an 18,000 mile a year round trip from Asia to Africa. So in the fall, they depart their breeding grounds and they make a big loop down through the lowlands of Southeastern Asia. They avoid flying over the Tibetan Plateau. I mean, you really don't want to be flying, if you're a tiny little insect-eating falcon, you don't want to be flying over the Himalayas if you can avoid it. And they time their arrival in northeastern India and surrounding areas in late October and early November. And they time it at the end of the monsoon season. And what happens in the monsoon after you get these flooding monsoon rains, it softens the ground, and trillions of subterranean termites. Now, these termites don't build big termite mounds like you'd see in Africa or Australia or other parts of the world. They live entirely underground. But at the end of the monsoon season, they chew tunnels to the surface. And then billions of winged fertile adults, males and females, called elates, emerge and fly on these great huge mating flights. And these bugs are big and they're fat and they're the perfect fuel for a bird that is going to set off on the longest overwater migration of any raptor. Because what happens is after the Amur falcons leave northeastern India, they fly 2,400 miles nonstop across the Indian Ocean to the Horn of Africa, and then all the way down into southern Africa, where they spend the winter. And they travel in great flocks. These, like broad-winged hawks here in the eastern United States, like Swainson's hawks in the western US. Amur falcons are social migrants, so they travel in enormous flocks. They winter in flocks of tens of thousands. And in fact, really the only other raptor in the world that has a migration route that is comparable in its immensity to the Amur falcon is the Swainson's hawk in North America, flying from the northern grasslands down to Argentina. And of course, Swainson's hawks don't have a 2,400 mile overwater crossing to make. So the area where they gather in late October and November in northeastern India, especially in the state of Nagaland, is a critical stopover point in their migration. But it is an unsettled part of the world. This is a part of the world that we've been hearing a lot about the last couple of years, with Rohingya refugees pouring across the border from Myanmar. Nagaland is right on the Myanmar or Burma border. And you can see from this map in Google Earth, all those red borders, those are disputed boundaries between India and China. India and China went to war in 1960 over those lands. They have remained on a hair trigger ever since. It's a part of the world that is still fairly dangerous, and in fact, a part of the world that was closed to outsiders and even to other Indians until just a few years ago. Nagaland is the defiantly un-Indian part of India. It is not ethnically Indian. It is not religiously in sync with the rest of India. It is so different topographically that you can see the difference from space. The border of Nagaland and the neighboring state of Assam to the east, or excuse me, to the west there, literally shows up from space. I mean, Assam is almost entirely flat. It's mostly rice paddies and rice farms. And then as soon as the land starts to move up into hills and mountains, that's the boundary with Nagaland. Nagaland is ruggedly mountainous. It is sparsely inhabited, largely forested. It's also a difficult place to get to. Where we were trying to get on this expedition, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, was the village of Pangti. And getting to Pangti is not for the faint of heart. We flew from Newark to Delhi, Delhi to Guwahati, Guwahati to Jorhat, then overland through Assam, and then up through the mountains of Pangti. It took days and days and days of travel. Our goal was to get to this reservoir. There's a reservoir that was built on the Doyang River in 2000. And this part of the story, it's a little hard to explain because we don't really know what happened. Amur falcons have always migrated and staged up during their migration in northeastern India. That has not changed. But when this huge reservoir was built in 2000, we don't know if it changed the local microclimate or exactly what happened, but enormous numbers of Amur falcons began roosting in these, I mean, just by the tens or hundreds of thousands in tightly packed roosts along the edges of the Doyang Reservoir. That's something that had not happened before, and it had tremendous ramifications for the falcons and for the people that lived in that area. Around 2010 or so, the woman on the right there, her name is Bano Horalu. Bano began hearing rumors about huge numbers of Amur falcons in Nagaland. Now Bano is a native Naga. She's a member of the native ethnic hill tribes that inhabit that part of Nagaland. She was a well-respected television journalist, had made her living and a reputation elsewhere in India. But around that time, she had moved back to Nagaland and had established a wildlife conservation trust. And so she heard rumors about these enormous numbers of falcons, but she also heard disturbing rumors that many of these falcons were being killed. So in the fall of 2012, Bano and three of her companions, three of her colleagues from Conservation India, which is another conservation nonprofit, headed to Nagaland to find out exactly what was going on. And what they found shocked and appalled them, and in turn shocked and appalled much of the conservation community and the rest of the world. And I want to share a little bit, there's no audio with this video, but I want to share a little bit of the video that they produced that fall. And I will say in advance that some of the images in this are somewhat disturbing, but I think it's important to understand what they were up against. So what had happened was the fishermen in this area discovered that they had these enormous roosts of falcons and that they could use their fishing nets. They could string these nets in the trees around these roosts late in the day and catch tens and tens of thousands of falcons very easily. And so over the course of about the 10-day peak of the migration in late October and early November, they were killing about 140,000 Amur falcons. They were killing them for food, although not necessarily for themselves. They were primarily plucking these and smoking them and selling them in communities elsewhere in Nagaland. Now, Amur falcons are very common, but 140,000 Amur falcons is not a sustainable harvest. And so when word got out in the fall of 2012 about this, there was outrage and almost universal condemnation from around the world, because it was clear that if this slaughter continued for any length of time at all, the Amur falcon was going to go from being one of the most common raptors in Eurasia to being one of the most endangered. Amur falcons, though, have become a symbol of something remarkable, because what happened in a very short period of time is that all of that stopped. Now, part of the reason for that was because the Indian law enforcement authorities, which had been turning a blind eye to this falcon kill for years, I mean, technically it was illegal. And so when there was so much international outrage, the Indian government had no choice really but to start enforcing the laws. And they did. They cracked down quite a bit on this killing. But it was also a case of a really concerted conservation education program that convinced the local community that they needed to protect Amur falcons. They made a very difficult decision to turn away from a falcon kill that economically benefited virtually everybody in the communities around the Doyong Reservoir. And within a matter of a year, shut it down completely. Hundreds of the former falcon trappers became members of the newly founded Amur Falcon Roost Area Union, which was a protective association. They set themselves up as birding guides. It was one of the most remarkable conservation turnarounds in raptor conservation that I have ever heard of. And in a matter of a couple of years, instead of international outrage, there was an outpouring of praise and delight on the part of international conservation communities and raptor conservation organizations. That kind of good news does not come along all that often. But one of the reasons that they did this, that the communities in Nagaland turned away from falcon killing and turned toward falcon conservation, is because they were told this is one of the most amazing natural sites in the world, and tourists will come to see this. Outsiders will want to see this. You can make money from falcon tourism. Problem is, Nagaland, as you will see, is an extremely difficult place to get to. And I've been hearing that tourists were rather thin on the land. And so I wondered what happens when very poor people make a very difficult, wrenching economic decision for the right reasons, but upend their economic lives. And the change that they're expecting is slow to materialize or may not materialize at all. And, Nagaland is not just a difficult place to get to, it can be a dangerous place to get to. It is the site of the longest running guerrilla war in Asia. It's been going on for 80 years. Nagaland has been trying to break away from the rest of India for generations. There's a major problem with cross-border insurgency across the border from Myanmar. In fact, about 2 weeks before my trip there in the fall of 2017, there was a firefight between Indian military units and Myanmar insurgents that left about 40 people dead. The Indian military also has a horrific human rights record. As recently as less than 10 years ago, they were involved in massacres and burning villages to the ground, raping. It's been a bad situation in Nagaland for a long time. It is better now than it was, but it's still, we were warned repeatedly not to be on the road after dark because of the risk from insurgents and the risk from bandits. But if it's going to be possible to save Amur falcons, a lot of it's going to depend on tourism. So my good friend Kevin Lachlan from Levittown, who is the owner of Wildside Nature Tours, Kevin decided it was worth doing a test run to see whether it was possible to take American tourists in to see what is arguably the largest concentration of raptors on the planet. Millions and millions of Amur falcons packed into small areas in this remote part of India. So in late October 2017, I set out with Kevin, along with my good friend Catherine Hamilton from California, who is a well-known and respected bird artist whose participation was underwritten by Zeiss Optics. Peter Trueblood, who's gone on a whole bunch of Kevin's trips and decided that he wanted to be a paying guinea pig on this trip, along with his cousin Bruce Evans from Maryland. The five of us were going to head in, see what the lay of the land was, find out whether it would be possible for Kevin to start running regular trips into Nagaland to support this community-based ecotourism that the Naga were starting. But you got to get there first. It is a difficult place to get to. This is an aerial shot here of the main road through Nagaland, twisting and winding up through the mountains, not a little bit of it paved, and we were not going to be on the main road. In some places, the road we were on was not bad. This is a nice big modern bridge across one of the river crossings, but for the most part, that's what the road looked like. The monsoon season is a rough time to travel, and normally we would have been going in there several weeks after the monsoons had ended, but the monsoons because of climate change, are less predictable in India than they once were. And in 2017, the monsoons and the floods just continued week after week after week. And so, the last, 70 miles or so on these roads took absolutely forever. And all it takes is one lorry, one truck that gets itself stuck to plug up everything else. And in places, we were actually driving across active landslide zones where, 2 weeks ago, the mountain just let loose and slipped down, and they dragged out a bulldozer and they bulldozed another road across there. And the next time it slides, they'll just do the same thing. And you just hold your breath and try not to look down, literally hundreds of feet off this sheer drop off. You try not to notice the fact that the entire road bed is jiggling like jello as you're driving over it. It's exciting. But at the end of all that, you do eventually reach the Doyang Reservoir. And it is a gorgeous part of the world. It is these old crumpled hills clad almost entirely in forest. Our destination, as I said before, is the village of Pang Ti. Pang Ti, like most of the Naga villages, is built on a high, easily defensible ridge site because the Naga are divided into a host of tribal and subtribal units, many of them speaking mutually unintelligible local dialects. And until fairly recently, just a generation or so ago, they were still warring with each other. The Naga were headhunters up until, as I said, just a generation or so ago, even though Nagaland is 95% Baptist, thanks to American missionaries that came in there starting in the mid-19th century. So yes, Baptist headhunters. It is an unusual part of the world. The main language there is English, as opposed to Hindi and much of the rest of India. Like I said, it is the very un-Indian part of India. And the Naga are not ethnically Indian. They are a Tibeto-Burmese ethnic group related to the hill tribes of northern Myanmar and nearby Tibet. There are no hotels. There is no tourist infrastructure in Pang Ti. We were staying with a local school teacher and his wife. That's their home, sort of on the right side of this complex. Their hospitality could not possibly have been better. They basically moved out of their house and allowed us to move in. When they built the hydroelectric dam, the Doyang Reservoir, that provided electricity to the neighboring communities, including Pang Ti, but most of the homes still have open hearth fires and dirt floors in the kitchen. The Sopo family moved out, allowed us to live in their house. What we did not realize is that the Naga do not use mattresses. So it was very comfortable, except for the fact that we spent about a week and a half sleeping on very, very hard wooden beds. It was very good for my posture. We did finally make it to Pang Ti just as the sun was going down. We beat darkness just by a little. We'd been exhausted. We'd been on the road traveling for about 5 days at that point. And we were really anxious to get out the next morning to see the falcons. And so as we unpacked and started to eat a little bit of a very late dinner, we asked a couple of the local Amur Falcon Roost Area Union guides how the migration had been going, and were shocked when they said, yeah, there's 1,000 or 2,000 birds. We were expecting millions, not 1,000 or 2,000. We had spent 2 years putting this trip together, hoping to see millions of falcons, not 1,000 or 2,000. It is not much of an understatement to say we were crushed. It was very difficult to sleep that night, not just because of the lack of mattresses, but we got ourselves up at 3 o'clock in the morning and loaded into our vehicles and drove about 45 minutes on these old roads down into the valley to the reservoir, and parked, and then hiked for about another kilometer or kilometer and a half through tall elephant grass, hearing the trumpeting of wild elephants off in the distance. And in hearing, as we got closer and closer to the watchtower that had been built near one of these roost sites, these birds will gather in incredibly tight roosts. It might only be, 2 or 3 hectares of forest, in which at the peak of the migration, there might be 100,000 falcons packed in there. As we got closer and closer to the watchtower that they built, we could hear the wind picking up and the breeze blowing through the through the elephant grass, which is very, very tall. It's about 15 or 20 feet tall, and tall enough that we couldn't actually feel the breeze down where we were. Climbed up into the tower in the darkness, couldn't really see much for a long time. We could hear the sound of breeze blowing overhead. And then at one point, Catherine raised her binoculars into the gloom and looked and gasped and said, "Oh my God, look." And when we looked with our binoculars, we realized the sound we were hearing was not wind blowing in the bamboo, but the sounds of the wind blowing through the wings of tens of thousands of Amur falcons that were already in the pre-dawn darkness coming up off the roost. I have been watching bird migration for my whole life. I have seen some of the greatest raptor concentrations on the planet. I was one of the people in 1992 that was in the first team doing the count in Veracruz in Mexico. I have never seen a raptor site like this, the site of the falcons coming off their roosts in Nagaland. And this just went on for hours. You would just see wave after wave of tens of thousands of falcons coming up, rising up into the air, kettling and drifting away. And every time you'd see one of these great exhalations of birds, you'd think that must be it. That's got to be the last of them. And then you'd train your spotting scope on the trees, and they would be just as densely packed with falcons as they had been earlier. I still don't know whether it was just a mistranslation the night before, that they didn't understand us or we didn't understand them, or if the falcons had all just arrived, which is entirely possible because the migration had been quite late that year because the monsoon was late. But it was not just 1,000 or 2,000 falcons. That morning we probably had somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 Amur falcons in that one roost site. It is still, that is one of the memories that I will carry with me until my very last days. One of the most awe-inspiring moments of raptors I've ever experienced. So let's talk a little bit about Amur falcons. So as I said, they're about the size of an American kestrel. The juveniles of both sexes, and the adult females are streaky below and gray and brown above, with a dark mustache. The adult males are this very elegant paler gray below, dark gray on the head, and rusty chestnut around the flanks and their upper thighs. They're very similar in appearance to red-legged falcons, and in fact, and red-legged falcons are found farther to the west in Eurasia. And up until a few years ago, they were considered conspecific, but then the Amur falcon and the red-legged falcon were split. We weren't just watching Amur falcons, obviously. There's a lot else to see there. Although, the birding, while it was good, was not spectacular. Now, part of that was because we were there in late fall. And as anybody who birds in North America or anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere knows that, birding in autumn is not the same as birding in spring or during the breeding season. But we did see a lot of other, classic Northeast Indian species like black drongo and long-tailed shrike, and a really absolutely staggering diversity of butterflies. I have never seen, even in the neotropics, have never seen a diversity of butterflies as I did in Nagaland and some of the surrounding areas. In fact, there were some days where we spent more time watching butterflies than we did watching birds. But another reason why the birding was a little bit sparse was because there are not necessarily as many birds, especially around the villages. The Naga are incredibly avid hunters. I literally cannot remember seeing any male over the age of about 16 who was not carrying a shotgun or a .22 rifle or an air gun, or any kid under the age of 16 who didn't have a slingshot. Or in the case of this guy, as you can see, he's got a slingshot stuck on the right side of under his belt there. Small birds, as is the case today in the Mediterranean and many parts of Europe, and it was the case in much of the United States 100 years ago, small birds are considered food. And so particularly around the villages, you don't see or hear a lot of birds. You got to get away from the villages. When you walk through the villages, you'll see a lot of signs of hunting. This is the skull of a mithun, which is one of the semi-wild, semi-domestic wild cattle that are found in that part of India. And you'd see a lot of skulls of barking deer, muntjac, and we'd hear barking deer quite a bit at night. They have an explosive dog-like bark, and as you can see, looking at the front of the muntjac skull there on the left, they have canine teeth. They're a fanged deer. But you know, the big game in particular is very sparse in Nagaland. Tigers have been gone now for about 15 years, except for an occasional one that will show up and almost immediately be killed. This is definitely a land that needs a conservation ethic. This is Pang Tea. There's about 500 households in Pang Tea. It's dominated by the Baptist church. Like I said, 95% Baptist. Even the Maoist insurgents that come in from Myanmar are mostly Baptist. It is an odd part of the world. Pang Tea is isolated, but it's not completely cut off from the rest of the world. It has electricity. There's a lot of, some of the more modern houses have television, you know, dishes on their houses. But it is remote and difficult to get to. And Catherine was told repeatedly that she was the first Western woman anybody in Pang Tea had ever seen. We men were not that much of a novelty because there were British soldiers there during World War II. But Catherine was absolutely the first Western woman they'd ever encountered. It's a lovely village. Traditional hill country architecture, a lot of flowers. As I said, some of the houses are modestly modern with, you know, with TVs and electric stoves, but the majority of the houses in the community have traditional woven bamboo walls, dirt floors, open fireplaces. This is one of Kevin's photographs that I really love. This is a very typical Naga home. Mr. Sopo, our host on the right, was anxious for us to meet his parents. His mother is 98 and blind. His father is 102, and he was the most renowned tiger hunter in the community. And he is still ready for action. He keeps his tiger spear close at hand. And you can't see this in the photograph, but his left hand, the palm of his left hand, is covered with white scars from the time that he got jumped by a tiger in the forest and had to fight it off with his machete. Tough guy. Mr. Sopo was also very proud of a number of his father's old hunting trophies, like this muntjac skull. You know, I mentioned that the Naga, up until even just a generation ago, a lot of Indians consider Nagaland kind of the Wild West of India, and you can get that sense walking through the community and looking at, as in this case, a tombstone. This is a fellow who died in 1947, and his tombstone, as you can see there, commemorates his killing of 4 or 5 tigers, 1 or 2 leopards, an elephant, and the taking of 6 human heads. This was 1947, that was during World War II, when the Battle of Kohima was fought between British and Indian forces and the Imperial Japanese Army. Those might have been Japanese heads. They might have been British heads, because some of the Naga fought with the Japanese, thinking it was a good way to finally get out from under the heel of Great Britain. Headhunting has stopped in Nagaland. It has, in some of the most remote areas, it may have lasted until the 1980s. Until a generation or so ago, you would have seen old war trophies displayed in people's homes from generations past, or in some cases, the village might have had a house where old war trophies, where old skulls were stored. That is no longer the case. The Naga today are reluctant to talk about it. I think they're somewhat embarrassed by this part of the past. But you know, Indians that I would run into, and when I told them I was going to Nagaland, they kind of, you know, say, "Watch your head! Don't, you know, those crazy headhunters. You got to watch your head there." We found the Naga to be an absolute delight. They were extraordinarily welcoming, and their culture is extremely strong. I mean, it's been very little dilution from outside forces. We had an opportunity one day to spend some time with some of the women in the village of Pang Tea. They invited us to come for what they call a sing, where they're getting together to grind up rice. And the women do that by singing rhythmic songs. And in fact, I have a little bit of video here. And of course, winnowing the rice to get the hulls and the husks out. It's a little bit like a walking song in the Scottish Hebrides, where they're walking the tweed and keeping the rhythm going that way. It's a very hard rice, and it takes a lot of work. And we were invited to try it, and we declined because there was absolutely no way we could do that without smashing our feet. And of course, when you're working like that, there's always somebody around to pick up the scraps. So, I talked before about what a wrenching change this was for the village of Pang Ti and some of the neighboring communities to give up killing falcons, which was something that the entire community had a hand in. They were either trapping, or they were plucking and processing and smoking, or they were actively involved in selling. Almost every family in the community made money from this. And this is not something that they had done traditionally. I mean, these large falcon concentrations had only just started about 10 years earlier. So they were, they viewed this as good Baptists. They literally viewed this as manna from heaven. But when they gave it up, it was a blow. I mean, many of the families used the money that they made during the fall from the falcon hunt to pay the school fees for their kids. You have to pay for your kids to go to school in many parts of Europe, or in many parts of India, especially past a certain grade level. And so it was a real blow for them to give this up. Now, obviously they are making some money from tourism, but there's far less income equity than there was before. For example, in Chomo Adoyo, the fellow there on the left, and Chomo was one of the trappers, and he used the money from his falcon trapping to pay for the school fees for his kids, including a couple of his kids that were away at boarding school, which is quite expensive. If you want to get even a higher secondary education, you really need to. You can't do that locally. You've got to go away. Now Chomo is an incredible bird watcher, and he's rapidly gaining reputation as the best birding guide in Nagaland. So he's making money that way. Relatives of his own some of the land where the falcons roost, and they built this, several of these watchtowers. There's, tourists pay a small fee to go there, so there's money coming in from that. The guides are earning some money. Families like the Sopos, with whom we were staying, they had enough money to put a Western style, can't exactly call it a flush toilet, but it was a toilet with a seat and a bucket that you could pour water in to flush, which is better than a squat pit. But in the past, everybody in the community benefited from the falcon hunt. Now, only certain families and certain groups in the community are benefiting from it. And if they're going to make falcon conservation a success, they're going to have to figure out a way to make it a success for everybody in the community. And there's not necessarily always forward thinking about what consequences are. For example, the fellow that owns the land on which the largest and most accessible of these roosts occurs cut about a quarter of that roost down to plant teak. Now planting teak trees is a very traditional, very popular way of sort of form of agroforestry in this part of Nagaland. Most of those forests you see in the background there are quite young. Many of them are teak forests. They're cut when they're only 20 or 30 years old, constant cycle. But he didn't seem to have thought through that maybe if he cuts down the trees where the falcons roost to plant teak, the falcons would go away, because he makes more money from the falcon roost than he does from teak. So, I mean, there's a certain lack of sophistication on the part of some of the locals. They just haven't quite figured out how all these pieces fit together. I will also say that Nagaland is the only place I think I've ever traveled, the only remote part of the world I've ever traveled, where conservationists are begging for better roads. You know, in most parts of the world, roads are the death of conservation. They bring in more people, they bring in more development, they drive wildlife away. But Bano Haralu and some of the other conservationists working there have said, if we had better roads, it would make it easier to bring tourists in here. There'd be much greater impetus for local communities to move away from fairly destructive practices and embrace conservation and ecotourism. And I have to say that's absolutely true. I mean, if you had decently paved roads along these few main tracks in Nagaland, instead of turning into this morass during the monsoon season, you know, what is now an 8 or 12 hour, you know, tooth-jarring, bone-breaking trip would be an easy couple of hours. And you could pair the Falcons in Nagaland with one of the crown jewels of Indian ecotourism, which is Kaziranga National Park in the neighboring state of Assam. They're only about 70 miles apart. It would be an easy one-day trip between the two of them instead of a really grueling marathon. And Kaziranga National Park opens for the season right around the same time in early November that the Falcons are at their peak. Kaziranga has 3,000 Indian one-horned rhinos. It's the largest one-horned rhino population on the planet. A host of other big game, wild buffalo, swamp deer, wild elephants, swamp pigs. The birding is phenomenal. We saw Pallas's fish eagle and red-wattled lapwings and great hornbills. Pairing these two would be an ecotourism no-brainer. But right now it would be impossible. It's not impossible, but difficult to do. Not that you would want to get the huge crowds that they get at Kaziranga. I don't think you would want that, nor would you need that. But just, you know, a small percentage of the folks that come to Kaziranga every year going up to Nagaland would make a huge difference for conservation in Nagaland. So, you know, during the week and a half or so that we were in Pangti, our usual routine was to get up, you know, at the crack of dawn in the morning and go out to the watch sites and watch the falcons depart from the roost. And then they would drift off during the course of the day. They'd fan out across the countryside feeding on termites. And then late in the day, when the falcons are heading back to the roost, we would as well. And the last day that we were there, you know, it's always kind of poignant at the end of a trip. You don't want to really let go. And for some reason that evening, the falcons were very late coming back to the roost. The sun was setting. We could hear wild elephants trumpeting in the distance. It wasn't really until the sun was down and the moon was high in the sky that the falcons began coming back by the hundreds, and then by the thousands, and then by the tens of thousands. And as it got dark and you had this gibbous moon hanging up in the sky, you could actually see this little flicker of movement of dark shapes darting across the disk of the moon. And they were passing with such frequency that I thought, okay, so I can calculate the distance across the entire sky that's represented by the disk of the moon, and I can keep track here over and start to calculate and extrapolate how many birds are passing overhead. But you know, sometimes you just stop counting. Sometimes you just let science fall away. The numbers don't matter. And as we sat there in the evening listening to the frogs and the crickets chirping, watching tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of falcons drawn back in, kind of like almost as if they were being drawn into a black hole or vortex from every point on the compass to the central place, with none of the sound that we heard in the morning when they're actively flapping. All of these birds were gliding in silently, just sheets and sheets of falcons coming in. Just an extraordinary thing to see, and to realize that we can do the right thing. We humans can do the right thing when we put our minds to it. And here at this one point in this extraordinary migration, at least for the moment, these birds are safe. So we're trying our best. You know, people will often ask me when I'm talking about the Amur Falcons, you know, what can I do to help? And one of the best things you can do to help is go there. And in fact, Kevin decided, yeah, absolutely, this is the kind of place we can take at least adventuresome travelers. And so Wildside has run a couple of trips to Nagaland to try to directly support the local community, bringing our own mattresses with us because you don't want to spend a week sleeping on a hard mattress. Obviously, that's a little bit harder right now in the age of coronavirus, and I worry about how the at least temporary collapse in international ecotourism is going to play out in Nagaland. I'm really concerned that some of the communities may decide that it makes more sense to treat falcons as a commodity than as a renewable resource. I don't think that's going to happen, but it is a concern. Hawk Mountain has also been very involved in this. I had the pleasure of recruiting Hawk Mountain's first two Indian international conservation trainees. The fellow there on the left is Devin Mehta. Devin, at the time, he was a grad student. At the time, he was studying the diet of Amur Falcons. And the fellow with the incandescent grin is Lanso Lotha. Lanso is a native Naga. He works for the State Forestry Department there, and one of his jobs is protecting the Amur falcons and doing interpretation with the local communities. And those local communities have started Amur falcon festivals. They really have embraced falcon conservation. And Lansa and Devin have taken the techniques and the skills and the enthusiasm that they learned at Hawk Mountain and taken them back to their home country to work on falcon conservation. So, as I said before, the landscape for migratory birds is challenging around the world, and so these occasional really optimistic stories like the one in Nagaland, I think we have to embrace. And so, with that, I will say thank you very much. It is always a pleasure to talk to a Hawk Mountain audience, even if we're not sitting downstairs in the visitor center or down at the education building or up on the lookout. And Jamie, I think maybe you have some questions from folks. Is that right? I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll go back to that.
Wonderful. Scott, thank you so much. That was such an inspiring presentation, and lots of comments in the chat from viewers saying that they're really enjoying it. So way to go. And I also just wanted to point out this pin that Lanso gave me when he was here during the traineeship from Nagaland. So I was proud to wear that today. So Scott, another comment just came in, fascinating. You mentioned the best way, what can people do to help? And you said to go there and support the ecotourism. If that's not an option right now for people, is there another way that people can make a donation to the organization that your colleagues in Nagaland work with?
Yes, and I don't have that handy right now, but I will get that information, and maybe we can send that to folks who have registered for this to make a contribution to the Nagaland Wildlife and Conservation Trust, which Bana Haralu started. That would be a terrific idea.
Absolutely, I'm happy if you send that information to me. I will email that out, as well as the link to the recording of this presentation, which will not be on YouTube. So we do have, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say also, if folks are interested, I'll include the link to the full video that I showed you some snippets from, which was the one that they did in 2012 when this first emerged. Okay,
thank you. Just lots of applause and things coming through. Scott, about your books, and especially your book is going to be released next April. If people are interested in purchasing your book, how can they go about doing that?
I don't know that I don't think it's available for pre-order quite yet. It's going to be published by W.W. Norton. The book is called A World on the Wing, and you can pre-order it from the publisher as soon as the last time I checked, they did not have it available for pre-order, but it's been a couple of weeks, and it should be up there fairly soon for pre-order. And of course, we will have it. We will have it available at some point at Hawk Mountain. I'll come down for a visit, and I'll bring a crate with them and with me, and we can do a book signing or something out at a appropriately socially distant setup out in the amphitheater.
That sounds great, and I believe our bookstore manager may be watching this program now. So wonderful. And T is saying absolutely, let's do it. So thank you so much. I think, the main questions were just how people that are coming in or how people can help even if they
Yep.
can't travel there. So this is fantastic. And Scott, do you have any updates on what any of your contacts now are doing there, or Lonso?
The last time I heard from Lonso was in mid-April, when he actually contacted me to find out. He was very worried about us because, of course, he'd been hearing about the pandemic that was really hitting primarily the northeastern U.S. He was concerned about how everybody was at Hawk Mountain, and wanted to make sure that we were all right. Devin, the other trainee, is not working in Nagaland. He's working actually at the opposite side of India now, up in northwestern India, on harriers and a number of other species of raptors for some of his graduate work.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
So we do have another question that came in.
Mhm.
Besides the human predation, has the Amur migration concentration attracted wild falcon predators?
Oh, that's a great question. We don't really know much about that. I would be shocked to find out that it didn't. I mean, if you've got 60,000 falcons roosting in one small area, and there's large owls, like, for example, eagle owls that live in that area, I'm sure they were picking them off. And in fact, what we would see in the morning is these waves of falcons taking off, getting spooked by, like, even just having Indian crows fly over the roost. And so, other larger raptors are certainly a risk to them. But the fact is, we know almost nothing about the migration biology, the ecology of these birds. Interestingly enough, what we do know, they're insectivorous, and they're staging up in Nagaland to feed on termites. During the winter, when they're wintering in southern Africa, they form very large roosts there. Now, it's not on the order of several million, but still, tens of thousands in a roost, and they're feeding on termites there as well. And there's some recent research to suggest that when they're making that 2,400-mile crossing from India across the Indian Ocean to Africa, there are a number of species of migrant dragonflies that migrate from India to Africa as well, along those same routes. And so, just as we see kestrels and merlins and broad-winged hawks picking off insects as they're going over North Lookout and eating them on the wing, it's entirely possible that the Amur falcons are doing that as well on their migration. But I mean, they are collectively eating. Well, in fact, there was a paper published a couple of years ago about their diet in South Africa, and the title of the paper was, "How do you make 2.7 billion termites disappear?" And the answer is Amur falcons.
Great. Wow. Thank you. We had another question come in, Scott. Is there much slash and burn agriculture or in-migration from the rest of India?
So that's a really good question, because actually the traditional form of agriculture in Nagaland is, they call it jhum, but it's a form of slash and burn agriculture. And on talking to Bono believes that on a small traditional scale, it's a very sustainable, kind of low ecological impact form of agriculture, where a small plot was cleared, it was farmed, it was allowed to go fallow for 30 or 40 or 50 years, and then it was farmed again. What's happening now is that there's more and more agriculture in Nagaland for cash crops that they're shipping out by road, and they're cycling through these jhum plots much more quickly. It's interesting. You look at Nagaland from a distance, and you have these entirely forested mountains, but when you get into them, there's no old forest. There's nothing that's more than about 30 or 40 years old, and I think that plays into some of the lack of diversity in numbers of birds, because when you get into some of the neighboring states, especially up in the foothills of the Himalayas, you've got these extremely large tiger preserves where there's a lot of virgin or at least very mature forest. It's much more complex forest structure. There's a lot more bird diversity in there. So so agriculture is certainly having an impact on that. And the communities. Part of the problem, and I kind of skipped over this earlier, and I should have mentioned it. Part of the problem that Pang T faced when they built that reservoir in 2000, the reservoir flooded all the fields that the villages traditionally farmed for hundreds or thousands of years down in the valley. And so they were forced up into the hills. The hillsides are not particularly fertile. There's a lot more conflict with wild elephants, which destroy the crops. And the fishermen have a hard time because they didn't cut the trees down in the valley. They just flooded the valley. And so it's a difficult place to use nets. And so, I mean, it literally did seem like manna from heaven to all of these devout Baptists when, at a time when they'd lost their farm fields and they were having trouble fishing, suddenly all these falcons showed up. It's kind of hard not to see that as divine intervention. And they didn't realize how far these birds were flying. They didn't realize how dangerous it was for the birds' population for them to be killing so many of them. And when they were told and it was explained to them, they said, okay, we'll stop. I mean, it really, just imagine our society just turning their back on something that's making a lot of money because you realize it's the right thing to do. We're not very good at that.
It's an amazing story, and what a successful example of community-based conservation.
Absolutely.
I'm so glad that you're sharing this story. So we do have another question. Just after I saw Amur Falcons in South Africa, there were roosts hit badly by hailstorms. Is that a common hazard for them in South Africa?
I've heard of it happening. I can't say how common it is, but I have heard of that happening a few times. And if you get a really bad hailstorm, you get all these birds packed in there, and you can have thousands and thousands of birds that are injured or killed. So yeah, that's definitely a problem. On the flip side of that, one of the interesting things that's happened as Pang T has developed such a reputation as like the Amur Falcon capital of the world, conservationists have discovered there's a whole host of communities elsewhere in Nagaland and in some of the surrounding states like Assam that have been like, hey, wait a minute, we've got falcons too. And there's now fights over like, well, who's the real falcon capital of the world? This is not a bad problem to have. Yeah. I think we're getting a sense that the Amur falcon population may be larger than we thought it was, because there are many more of these roosts out there than we originally thought.
Thank you, Scott. And I think that concludes our questions for now. And Scott, fantastic program, so inspiring, so interesting. I'm ready to go to Nagaland. Let's plan.
Sign us up. Okay. Well, we should talk about running a Hawk Mountain trip over to Nagaland.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Jamie, thank you so much for making this possible. It's just a delight. I wish I were in Pennsylvania, but if this is as close as I can be to Hawk Mountain right now during the lockdown. So.
Well, it's nice to see you. Thank you so much. And thank you to our wonderful audience for joining us today. It means so much to us. So thank you. Stay tuned. Many more virtual programs coming your way soon, and a sneak peek into the virtual programs for next week. Next Wednesday, the 17th, we have PA Dutch Powwow with Porcupine Pat of the Schuylkill County Conservation District at 1:00 p.m. On Friday, June 19th, we have Learning Birdsong by Habitat with Holly Merker, and that's at 4:00 p.m. And then the following week, Wednesday, June 24th, we have Adventures in Antarctica at 1:00 p.m. And then that Thursday, June 25th, we have Sanctuary Storytime, Zoe Finds a Fawn at 11:00 a.m. And then Friday, June 26th, we have our Benefit for the Birds online auction and Year of the Kestrel, Saving the American Kestrel. And I believe that's at 7:00 p.m. So thank you everyone for joining us. Have a fantastic weekend, and we hope to see everyone again soon. And remember, our trails at Hawk Mountain are open. Check out our website, and you can order your trail tickets on ticketleap.com. Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.